welcome them as they come. So welcome to our August Lunch and Learn. Our Central Seminary's Lunch and Learns are a place for students, faculty, staff, alums, and friends of the seminary to come together and hear from different folks who are part of the seminary about their ministry, their scholarship, or their personal interests. Our Lunch and Learns began about a year and a half ago, and I've enjoyed in this time learning from lots of our faculty and staff and alums on different topics. And I worked hard to get some of the folks who haven't done our Lunch and Learns before to do our Lunch and Learn this month, but it's a very busy time of year with classes starting next week in one of our programs and the week after in the other one. So I have the awkward task today of introducing myself for our Lunch and Learn. But I'm excited that you're all here today. So my name is Jessica Williams, and I serve as the Director of Alumni Engagement and Lifelong Learning at Central. And I've been in that role since February of 2021. And prior to that, I served as Registrar and International Student Officer. And I'm also now the Director of Central's Peace and Justice Ministry certificates, and excited about that program. I'm currently pursuing a PhD at Kansas State University in adult learning and leadership with certificates in social justice, education, and qualitative research methods. So I'm working on my dissertation right now, hoping and praying, and if you would join me in prayer, I'd appreciate it, to finish this fall. And the working title for my dissertation is It's God's Work, a multiple qualitative case study of the use of the Bible in the movement to end poverty led by the poor in the US. So it's a little bit of a mouthful, but what I'm going to talk about today is a pilot study that I did in 2021 to kind of help shape the direction of my dissertation research. Lots of social movement learning researchers end up researching the movements that they're involved in. And so that's the case with the work that I'm doing as well. So I started being part of this movement to end poverty led by the poor in the US about almost 20 years ago, when I was started as a student at Union Seminary in New York City. And we started an organization called the Poverty Initiative, which is now the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice, which is an anchor organization for the Poor People's Campaign and National Call for Moral Revival. After my time in seminary, I pastored churches and tried to remain connected to the movement to end poverty, particularly by leading immersion trips with folks from my congregations and to meet with and learn from leaders in the movement to end poverty. I'm currently part of the Kansas Poor People's Campaign and the Freedom Church of the Poor. So I share all of that because in qualitative research, one of the things that we talk about a lot is the importance of our positionality, which is basically just helps you know who I am and where I'm coming from and why I care about this topic. So I just wanted to share those pieces. So I want to start off today, we're talking about using the Bible and the movement to end poverty. With just a little bit of discussion. You can put something in the chat or a couple people can come off mute. What do you think of when you think about poverty in the Bible? Are there verses that come to mind, questions that come to mind, statements that you've heard when you think of poverty in the Bible? Either in the chat or if anyone wants to come off mute, you're welcome to do that too.
I'll start.
Thanks, Tony.
I don't know that it was ever God's intention that there is poverty at all. You know, in reading through, we come across Micah scripture, and the very culture that the Bible came out of was that limited resource mentality that they had. And so everyone shared what there was supposed to, at least, and how it got to where that didn't happen. It's just, I think, a huge fault in humanity, but that was not God's intention. And that's kind of why we're doing what we're doing these days, is trying to fix that. But, you know, Jesus saying the poor you will always have with you is not necessarily, well, don't do anything about it because they're always going to be there. It's more like, we got to do something about this. This isn't the plan. No one should suffer like that.
Thank you. That's a great way to start us out. Any other thoughts that come to mind when you think about poverty in the Bible, or things that you've heard people say about poverty in the Bible?
First thing I think about is that it's an ignored topic.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to share, and Tony let us right there, so that was really helpful. One of the things we often hear when we think about poverty in the Bible is exactly the verse that Tony brought up, of the poor will be with you always. Another thing, and as Tony pointed out, there's both some understandings of poverty in the Bible that has shaped a lot of church ministries, and there's some misunderstandings about what the Bible says about poverty that has shaped some church ministries. I remember one time meeting with a pastor in Pennsylvania and having this conversation, and he said to me, well, you know, I try to pattern the ministries of our church after the verses in the Bible where it talks about teach a man to fish. And I asked him, where is that in the Bible? And he couldn't tell me, because it's not in there. So there's lots of kind of understandings, and as well as some misunderstandings that have shaped how church people and churches go about their anti-poverty work. And so that's why this is an important topic to me. I want to start off our time today, or continue in our time today, reading a passage of scripture and then sharing a short video from one of the leaders in the movement to end poverty who preached about the passage that we're going to read during a recent Freedom Church of the Poor service. And I just want to do this to use as an introduction to how the Bible is used in the movement to end poverty. And then I'll share a little bit about the research that I worked on over the spring, some of the things that I learned, and we'll have some time for discussion, and then I'll share some closing thoughts. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now and lead us toward, or bring up the passage that we're going to look at. It's pretty short, but if we could have a couple people that might just volunteer to read a verse or two at a time, and then the next person can pick up, that would be really great. So we are going to be reading today from Exodus chapter 5, verses 1 through 9. So anyone that'd like to start us off, please go ahead.
I will.
Thanks.
Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go so that they may celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness."
Anyone else, please jump in.
A little crazy is her name. That was her nickname growing up because her.
But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should listen to him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has revealed himself to us. Let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord our God, or he will fall upon us with pestilence or sword."
But the king of Egypt said to them, "Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their work? Get to your labors," Pharaoh continued. "Now that they are more numerous than the people of the land, and yet you want them to stop laboring."
That same day, Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people, as well as their supervisors, You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks as before. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But you shall require of them the same quantity of bricks as they have made previously. Do not diminish it, for they are lazy. That is why they cry, let us go and sacrifice to our God. Let heavier work be laid on them, then they will pay attention to it and not to deceptive words.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to do a little switcheroo here with my screen share. Just to share, I'm going to share just a couple minutes of a sermon given, like I said, by one of the leaders of the Freedom Church of the Poor, or this was given at Freedom Church of the Poor a few months ago by one of the leaders in this movement. His name is Keith Bullard, and he is with the an organization called Raise Up the South, which is connected to the Fight for 15. And he preached on this passage. We won't have time for the whole sermon today, but when he's done, when we're done watching the short clip that we'll watch, I'll put the link in the chat. It's on Facebook, and then you can watch the rest of it later if you'd like to go back and watch. Make sure I share my sound. There we go.
Thank you so much. So glad to be on here. Like I always say, but especially on today with so many amazing people. Happy Mother's Day to everyone. It's kind of hard to not get excited about this text, because this is a text that we've all been hearing for, all of our lives. It's this story. But it wasn't until really reading it as a member of Freedom Church of the Poor, having an understanding of how it really connects, and then reading the story as an organizer, and realizing that Moses was an organizer. He was the greatest organizers that we've seen, and there's so many lessons that we can learn from this. So excuse me if this will be a organizing teaching and guide somewhat. So briefly, once again, everybody, my name is Keith Bullard, and I'm with Raise Up the South. We are organizing the South, and for the past 9 weeks, we at Raise Up the South had launched an organizing academy where we had 50 passionate people that were just like Moses, who could not go along with the norm any longer, and they made a decision to break free from this worldly system of exploitation and oppression and began to unite with those that were organizing for liberation. Now, every day for the past 10 years, we've been hearing from workers about the horrific conditions that they have been working under. We hear from Bojangles workers who were forced to work in a store where they were exposed to COVID. And when they made the request to have the store professionally cleaned, the management responded by giving them more work. Sounds familiar, right? Gave them Clorox wipes, because that was the best way to clean the store when they requested, asked for a professional clean. We hear from Wendy's workers who for years had to deal with a 30-year-old male general manager who physically assaulted, verbally assaulted, and even sexually harassed 16 and 17-year-old workers. Now, when they spoke up about it, they were ignored. For years, they spoke up about this treatment and they were ignored. But when they took action, they created change. In these texts, we see clear organizing tactics, clear organizing strategies that we've seen. In chapter 5, we see where Moses and Aaron, they're lifting up the cries and the concerns of the workers to Pharaoh. We call this marching on the boss. And in organizing terms, this is marching on the boss. This is when workers come together to list out their grievances, to write them down. And the goal is to get a majority of the workers to sign on to a unified document that represents their issues, that they will go around and collect to show that this is how everyone at your store, at your establishment is feeling. And it normally comes with the time limit, saying management has X amount of time to respond. You know, we see Moses delivered the petition to Pharaoh, the boss. But obviously,
All right, unfortunately, I have to stop right there. It's a great sermon. I'm going to go ahead and put the link here in the chat right now before I forget. If you want to go back and watch the rest of it, basically, Keith goes through the rest of the passage in Exodus 5 and 6 and talks about how it's used as an organizing guide for in the organizing work that he does with the Fight for 15. And I just really learned a lot from him when he preached this sermon. And so I just wanted to share that as kind of an example, a lead-in and introduction to how leaders in the movement to end poverty, led by the poor in the US, are utilizing the Bible in their organizing in different ways. So let me go back once again to our slides here, and I'll share a little bit more about the research that I did with Keith and some other folks in the movement. So I interviewed Keith, that you just heard the excerpt of a sermon from, as well as 9 other leaders from different organizations that are a part of the movement to end poverty, and also looked at some of the Freedom Church of the Poor services, as well as some documents that are associated. And that's what I did for this pilot study research. And here on the screen, these are some of the research questions that I looked at. How do leaders in the movement to end poverty in the US describe the context of the movement and the use of the Bible within the movement? What reasons do they give for why they use the Bible, and what challenges do they face in doing so? And so for the next little bit, I'm just going to share with you a little bit of what I found. This next slide is a kind of a summary of those findings. I'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. But the first thing, first kind of theme from the data that I got was about how to define the movement to end poverty led by the poor. And one of those defining features is that ending poverty is possible. And that one of the key pieces of that that leaders in the movement use is the pedagogy of the poor, including collectivity, the dialectical relationship of conditions and consciousness, leadership of the poor, and leadership development. We'll talk about each of those. And then one example of that pedagogy of the poor is the praxis of reading the Bible with the poor, and some key themes around that, where how leaders find stories of the organized poor in the Bible and how they use the Bible with the Bible in terms of organizing to end poverty today. So as my first research question was to try to understand the context of the movement to end poverty. And what I really was hoping to try to do is kind of define the movement. But what I learned is that that number one wasn't a top priority for the leaders that I talked to in the movement. They weren't really interested in talking about putting boundary structures around the membership of who's in the movement, who's not, or the structure of the movement itself. Instead, there were other pieces that were way more important that the leaders of the movement to end poverty led by the poor talked about. And so that was a key learning for me that really influenced how I was thinking about my dissertation research now. But some of the most important pieces that leaders talked about is that the movement to end poverty led by the poor in the US today is a deep and a wide network of organized poor people. So poor people's organizations like the Fight for 15, like other organizations fighting against homelessness, for affordable housing, for just immigration policies, for just a whole host of things that different organizations are working on. And the interconnectedness of those issues in order to build a movement to end poverty was important. So that's associated too with this deep and wide network of relationships, particularly interpersonal relationships. A lot of the leaders I interviewed were part of a number of different organizations and knew, I think, all the other leaders that I talked to, and also a deep and wide network of institutions. And so instead of a membership or a movement structure, what was way more important to these leaders that I talked to was to be united around some fundamental principles. And the key one was that defines the movement is uniting the poor and dispossessed across differences to end poverty led by the poor. And we'll talk about each of those kind of pieces of that phrase as we go along. But uniting the poor and dispossessed across difference was really important. So all of the leaders of these organizations talked about the importance of crossing boundaries that are often put in place to divide the poor from one another, whether it's gender, sexuality, race, religion, language, all these other things. And we'll talk about that a little bit more too. But so instead of a membership structure, it was really more important for the leaders that I talked to think about the movement in terms of these defining principles. And this is just a picture from a recent Freedom Church of the Poor service that shows not nearly all, but some of the organizations that are part of this movement, and just all of the different kinds of issues and things that they are working on. So the next finding was about that ending poverty is possible. Now that may seem like a given in a movement defined as a movement to end poverty, but I really wanted to point it out here because it's not a given. And a lot of leaders gave examples of people that they encounter, particularly in churches or in the community, who don't think that ending poverty is possible. Sometimes citing the verse that Tony opened us up with, that Jesus says the poor will be with you always. And so therefore ending poverty is not possible. So it was really a key important difference that a lot of the leaders talked about. Like we hold on to this. It defines who we are and what we do, that we believe that ending poverty is possible. And the reason that they talked about ending poverty as possible was an understanding that poverty, as they expressed it, is not inevitable, but is created by unjust systems. And a lot of the leaders have gone through studies of leadership development, collective study of political economy, of history, of their own lived experiences to arrive at this understanding, and talked about how poverty on the whole, when we think about kind of poverty in society, and not necessarily how particular individuals may experience it, but on a societal level, poverty is not temporary. It's not accidental. It's often not the fault of those who experience it, but it's structural. And as one leader said, it's even necessary for maintaining a capitalist economic system. And so if that's true, then the leaders talked about then ending poverty is possible. We just have to change that system. And that's what this movement is about. So I put here some of the quotes from some of the interviews. Keith, who we heard from in the sermon, said explicitly, poverty is not something we have to accept. We have the ability to change it. And Dan, I noticed as I was putting this together, I've used a lot of quotes from Dan, so we'll hear his name a lot today. He's with Put People First Pennsylvania, which is an organization working on healthcare access for everyone in Pennsylvania. And he's also with an organization called the University of the Poor. And he said the basic direction of development of the society, which is towards less need for human labor, means that as it develops, it's actually going to throw more people out of the workforce and out of any ability to get what they need to survive. Poverty means that you can't get what you need to survive, that you don't have access to it. But I think for us, the question of a struggle to end poverty today is immediately a struggle to recognize the whole society, to say that folks have a right to live, that folks have a right to not be poor. So a movement to end poverty is to really reorganize the whole society, to distribute things, not just through work and labor, but based on need. And so this was just a really important point that came up a lot about that ending poverty is possible. And with that, then the leaders had a pretty broad understanding, but a very specific analysis of who is poor and why poverty exists. Keith from Fight for 15 talked about, and I'm quoting here from an interview, adjunct professors who have got doctorate degrees and are literally working at Pizza Hut while they're teaching, who are members of the Fight for 15. In other interviews, people talked about students at public schools, people of many different income levels who don't have adequate health care, fast food workers, grocery store workers, renters who are facing eviction, homeowners facing foreclosure, those living without homes. So this was kind of a broad understanding of how the leaders talked about who was poor. So it wasn't kind of what we hear from federal poverty line, that it's based on income and that there's a line here, but it was really an understanding of people's just a whole of people's life situation. But they also talked about the poor and dispossessed. And what the leaders described as dispossessed is the effect of neoliberal privatization practices and how that fits with capitalism. And so dispossession is people losing homes, losing property, but just also not having access to the means of production in society. When I'm finished here, I'm going to put another link in the chat that explains a little bit more about what the movement means by this. It's called Who is Poor and Why Are We Poor? And it's just a really important aspect of this movement that the leaders talked about a lot. But based on this, then they had this theory of change based on this understanding of who is poor and why are we poor, that it is only through the uniting of the poor and dispossessed to reorganize society from the bottom up that poverty can be ended. So again, we have here a quote from Dan. The fundamental structures of the society are broken and unjust, but even more than that are in crisis right now. We're in a time of a really historic transition. And the only kind of force in society that can really lead a way through this crisis to reorganizing society on a better and just and stable foundation are the poor and dispossessed, the folks who are increasingly rendered disposable and superfluous in the system by this very crisis. And so because of that, have no stake in the system. But that won't happen automatically. The poor and dispossessed won't automatically be in a position to lead the kind of transformation that's needed. History tells us that only happens when people are organized and united. And particularly right now, huge resources are spent keeping the poor and dispossessed disorganized and disunited. And so the question becomes, how do we unite this revolution to take up this important task and mission to really transform the world? So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this kind of understanding that poverty is possible as an important finding, because it really undergirds then why and how leaders in this movement use the Bible in their work, which we'll get to a little bit more now. So one of those ways is through the Pedagogy of the Poor, which describes how the poor and dispossessed leaders in this movement go about their work of organizing and uniting the poor. And they do so, what I found in these interviews is that they do so through three main themes. The first being collectivity. The leaders I interviewed rarely, if ever, talked about their individual work alone. It was always we, it was always about uniting, collectivity, doing this work together. That was a really important part of it. Also, the dialectical relationship of conditions and consciousness, which just means that, that there's a relationship between the conditions that people live in and their understanding of those conditions. And that coming to that understanding is an important part of engaging in the work of ending poverty. And so leaders discuss their own circumstances of poverty that led them to be engaged in this movement, as well as their own process of coming to a consciousness and an analysis about why poverty exists, reflecting on their own conditions and their own lived experiences. And the third key theme here is around the leadership of the poor and leadership development. The leaders, through one of the defining features of this movement is an understanding of the leadership of the poor. As Dan said in that quote, that we need leadership from the ranks of the poor and dispossessed because they have no stake in the system. There's a quote from Reverend Dr. King that was quoted quite frequently, that the poor have little or nothing to lose. And if they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. And so that was really a key theme that the leaders, of really how they do their work a lot. And so developing the leadership of the poor was a really important piece of why and how the leaders use the Bible in their work to end poverty. Through processes that they've developed of leadership development, of political education. And they really stress that leadership development is not like a ladder that once you reach it, you're developed as a leader in the movement, but it's an ongoing process for everybody that's in the movement to continue that process. So far I've touched on kind of the first research question around the context of the movement. And so now I want to move us to really the piece about the Bible. Why the Bible, how the Bible, how the leaders use the Bible in their work. And so this is the piece about the praxis of reading the Bible with the poor, which is a practice of reading the Bible through the lens, the experiences, analysis, and the leadership of the organized poor who are working to end poverty. And so one of the key things that I found is that the leaders find within the Bible lots of reasons to be engaged in this work. They study the historical context of the biblical text, particularly through an empire critical lens. So understanding the text in the Bible as texts of oppression in some cases of empires that have conquered. And so reading it and understanding it through that lens. Again, here we have Dan who says, what all parts of the Bible have in it is a record of poor people struggling to reorganize society around their needs and putting forward a program that says that the right of people to live and survive is more important than the right of the wealthy and powerful to grow even more powerful. And that, if we want to think back to the verses that we read from Exodus chapter 5 and how Keith interpreted those verses within the Freedom Church of the Poor service, we see that, right? That in that, Keith was really, he brought a new understanding for me of how to read Exodus 5 as understanding Moses as a community organizer who's organizing these workers against the oppression of Pharaoh. Also, the leaders saw parallels within the Bible of the organized poor in the Bible. So again, one example is from Exodus chapter 5 and the organized poor today. And also biblical demands toward justice, but not just biblical demands. What was really interesting is to hear the leaders talk about how the Bible demands, calls us toward justice, but also gives us a roadmap to get there. So it's not just kind of a saying, this is what we need to do, but we have a roadmap for it. And again, citing some examples like Moses as the greatest organizer, or Jesus calling the disciples to join a movement for social change. Or one organization talked about Mary and Joseph's travels at the birth of Jesus as a journey of immigrants. And that was a key text that they use a lot in their work within their immigrant community. So seeing these parallels of stories of poor people in the Bible and today, and this roadmap to work toward justice, as Tony reminded us that that's what God desires. And then also, so not just in the Bible, but also with the Bible. So this was a key point as well. So the leaders talked about one of the reasons that they use the Bible in their work is because of the Bible is so embedded into the mental terrain or the culture and the ethos of our country. And because of that, or not because of that, but with that, often the Bible is used in really harmful ways for a lot of marginalized communities, but particularly sometimes to keep the poor. And so the importance of understanding the Bible through a lens of liberation was really important for these leaders. They also talked about that organized poor people understand the historical context of the Bible really quickly and really, really well. One leader gave an example of leading a Bible study at a homeless shelter in New York City, and they were studying one of Paul's letters about justification by faith. And that in that Bible study at this homeless shelter, the folks that were part of this Bible study just came to a kind of a radically new interpretation and understanding of what justification by faith means, because they were drawing on their own experiences of poverty and homelessness. Because many of the stories that we have in the Bible do have parallels of conditions of poverty and oppression and homelessness even, that organized poor people can kind of really, really quickly make some of those connections to their daily lives as well. And so that was another reason that the leaders use the Bible in their work a lot. And another way that they use the Bible a lot is through exploring other freedom movements that have used the Bible in their organizing work. So two of the main ones that were cited regularly was the anti-slavery movement and the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which was a movement in the 30s and 40s in Arkansas, Missouri, and some other southern states of tenant farmers. And two of the key leaders of that movement were preachers and organized religious schools that were very connected to the union. And so union organizing and religious education were very, very much intertwined in that movement. And so some of the leaders in the movement today cite that as an example. So those were some of the key findings. And I just want to kind of close this out by talking a little bit about why does it matter? And many of the leaders talked about this too, that why it matters that they use the Bible in the movement to end poverty is because, as the leaders said in their words, there's a battle for the Bible going on today. The Bible is wielded against poor communities and other marginalized communities regularly. And there's an insidious way that the Bible is used to justify white Christian nationalism. And so understanding how the organized poor in this movement to end poverty understand the Bible, not just as a text of liberation, but also as a guide toward building a movement of liberation matters, to be able to counter within this battle for the Bible, how the Bible is being used to oppress and keep people poor today. So I am going to stop sharing my screen there and just open it up now we've got about 15 minutes or so before I'll do a little closing thoughts for some discussion. So I did kind of a fire hose of all this information that I learned from this study. So would love to hear some feedback, questions, comments, anything like that anyone might have.
Jessica, you talked about white Christian nationalism, and I like. I realize now, as I have aged, look back over my.
We're having trouble hearing you, Don. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me any better?
Not really.
Okay. Well, maybe my microphone's not picking up well.
That's better. That's better.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. I have looked back over my life and the years that I have lived and realized that, without really rationalizing it or being conscious about it, white Christian nationalism has been practiced by all of us, I think. Mm-hmm. And I certainly am guilty of that. I originally heard some of that discussion regarding race relations, but I realize now that I've heard you say it, that it involves poverty too. We have ignored the people who are in poverty because as long as I'm okay, I don't really care about anybody else. It's been kind of our attitude.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. We do think about white Christian nationalism kind of in, it affects a lot of things, I guess, about our public life. I want to go ahead and share a little quote here that I didn't share before related to that last slide, and that was in one of the documents that I looked at. But it said, we are confronted today with a dominant, distorted narrative disguised as biblically rooted that blames the poor for their poverty. Indeed, much like the Bible was used to justify U.S. chattel slavery, today's false moral narrative upholds beliefs, practices, and structures which degrade life and divide us from one another and perpetuate the violence of poverty. Churches and institutions of theological education are not immune to this narrative. And too often, the only message preached about poverty is if God wanted to end poverty, he would do so, or that poverty will only be ended in heaven. Conversely, others, like those in this movement, posit that poverty rather than the poor is immoral, and that it is the duty of Christians to practice jubilee, to protest unjust laws, and to help God's children repair the breach. There is a struggle between these two narratives, and an urgent need to expose and break down the distortions of the former and deepen our understanding of the latter. So I appreciate that, Dawn, a lot, that call to remind us of the breadth of how white Christian nationalism, the many dangers of it, including related to poverty. Other comments or questions that anyone has?
Is all of this going to be included in your dissertation?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Some of this kind of formed the basis for my dissertation, so not all of it will be written up in there. My current research is looking at 3 specific organizations. Raise Up the South that we heard Keith preached from, an organization called Chaplains on the Harbor, which works with homeless folks in Grays Harbor County, Washington, and an organization called Union de Vecinos, which is in Los Angeles, and works around tenant rights and renters' rights, as well as immigration. So my dissertation research will really focus on those 3 organizations specifically and the specific ways that they're using the Bible within their context. So this study is really more of a kind of a broad overview, and then that one will really drill down a little bit more specifically to how those organizations are utilizing the Bible.
I can't wait to read that.
Me too.
This is more like personal question. Was there any event that made you really interested in ending poverty, like throughout your life? Yeah,
it's a really good question. So I think some personal experiences of poverty that I didn't name as poverty at the time. It was within my involvement in the poverty initiative in seminary that we were studying the housing crisis of the 2000s, and through that I guess that relationship between conditions and consciousness, that was kind of my consciousness opening experience, where I realized that some struggles that my family had with our housing situation were not the result of kind of personal decisions, but were really the result of this systemic housing crisis. And I think that is one of the key moments that that really motivated me to continue on in this work, and trying to understand it, those systems, but then also trying to be part of ending poverty, and all its interlocking injustices. One of the things that the Poor People's Campaign is very clear about is that we can't end poverty without ending systemic racism, without ending militarism and the war economy, without ending ecological devastation, and without ending the distorted narrative of Christian nationalism. So yeah, Hannah, I think that was one of the key moments. Growing up, we did a lot of work in impoverished communities, And so I think that started to kind of build that understanding and motivation. But it was really that moment of kind of learning about the housing crisis and how that had impacted my family that really kind of solidified my resolve and passion for this work.
Jessica, on your platform here, do we dare envision what I might be able to do to make a difference? Realistically, what I might be able to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to answer the way that I think some of the leaders I interviewed might answer. And so one of the things that I mentioned that they really talked about was this collectivity, and how in our work to change unjust systems that we're stronger together, that we're more powerful together. And so there's lots of organizations around in the Kansas City area. I know you're in this area, as well as across. I mean, the leaders I interviewed were across the country. So there's organizations like this across the country and really around the world that are working on this. And so I think getting connected to one of those organizations is really a key part of it. Here in the Kansas City area, we have the Kansas Poor People's Campaign, and there's a Poor People's Campaign that's active in Missouri as well, and other organizations like More Squared, Metropolitan Organization for Racial and Economic Equity, and there's actually a lot that. But to me, I think connecting in with one of those organizations that is working to end poverty and its systemic injustice, or its interlocking injustices, and that's led by the poor, I think is a really, really key point here too. And so I'd invite anybody that's interested in doing that to look up one of those organizations, or if you don't know what that might be in your area, I'd be happy to try to find something. And I have a couple invitations that I'll close with when we get closer to time here too. We have about 5 minutes left for discussion. Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
This is an incredibly daunting task, and we all know that, we're all aware of that, but just the awareness of, my pastor talks about, if you want, the problem with change is in this type is that it threatens the wealth of those who, and the power of those who have money, and it's all about money. And to get them to let go of that, to change our society, is an incredibly daunting task. I can't even imagine it would ever be solved in my lifetime, but it's definitely something to work for. How do we change the hearts of those who are grasping at all of it? The Bezos, the Rockefellers. There's so many who have so much, and then there's the divide is getting greater. And yeah, the more we have working towards that change, the better. And I'm still figuring out how I'm involved, but seminary is a good start. So, but yeah, it's incredibly huge.
It is. Yeah, thank you for that.
This is Jim up in Des Moines, Iowa area. I think for me, I'm a social worker. It's my day job. We have this phrase in social work, the personal is political. And I think, whenever you can, to make sure that your involvement actually is getting you into relationship with, the people that you're actually wanting to liberate. So that too much of what we do is transactional. It's just, we're going to collect food for Thanksgiving. That's great. But what about after Thanksgiving? And so making sure you're connecting in ways. And I think you'll find that once people, kind of shift their focus in those ways, it breaks down a lot of maybe stereotypes and beliefs they have about people. and vice versa. So that's kind of how, you know, we try and organize the work that we do just in our own family system.
That's really helpful, Jim. Thank you.
As I think about what Tony was saying, I was thinking about Moses and, you know, how he got that whole thing to happen, and Pharaoh's heart, you know, I mean, God, I don't know, it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart, but he, you know, he finally let him go, but even then he acquiesced, so and sent his army after the folks, but they still got away, and then they were still fed, and so even with all that, I think, well, yeah, that gives me more hope that it's happened before.
Yeah, that's a really helpful example. We see a parable about that in the New Testament too, and some of the leaders I interviewed cited both what you just described, Dad, but also the parable of the unjust judge, where the widow keeps going back to this judge to get justice, and it isn't actually that the judge changes, like his heart is not changed. His heart is hard, but the widow is so persistent that he has no choice but to give in to her demands. And that is a really interesting parable that was cited a lot and by some of the leaders in this movement about how they go about their work, and coming up against kind of in different local contexts. In the research I'm doing now, one of the organizations that works with homeless folks, there was a sweep of the homeless encampment, and everybody's stuff was destroyed. And they talked about just the persistence of their organization going back and back and back and back and back to the public leaders that had done this, and that their hearts weren't actually changed, but they gave in because they were so persistent. So that some examples again of kind of a little bit of a roadmap that we have within our scripture text about how to go about these changes. Sometimes people's hearts are changed and sometimes they're not, and sometimes it's our persistence and our collective power, and as some people cited, God's preferential option for the poor, that is what makes these changes possible. I really appreciate everybody being here today and everybody's thoughts. I just have a couple kind of two invitations and then one closing reading to close us out today. Before I do all that, I do want to say that you're invited to join us for our next third Thursday Lunch and Learn in September. I'm trying to bring up the link here now. I should have had this ready already. But for this Lunch and Learn, Hannah Yu, who is with us today, and is Central's Registrar and International Student Officer, will be leading our session along with Sophie Che, and it is to help us learn Korean. Central has a large Korean population with our Korean programs, and so we'll be learning some Korean to help us communicate better with our students, our alums, our brothers and sisters in the Korean community. So I wanted to invite you to that. I just put the information there about that in the chat. So a couple other invitations related to our topic today. If you want to read a bit more about how some of the leaders in the movement to end poverty are using the Bible in their work, I recommend this book called We Cry Justice, Reading the Bible with the Poor People's Campaign. All of the leaders that I interviewed for my study have chapters in this book. It's a devotional book, and the leaders are all part of this movement, working with different organizations, working to end poverty and its interlocking injustices, and have some just incredible biblical interpretation and theology within this book about this work of building a movement to end poverty. So that is one invitation. Another invitation is, you heard me reference Freedom Church of the Poor. That is, Freedom Church of the Poor is a community, we call it the spiritual home for this movement. And we meet for worship on Sunday evenings at 5 Central Time on the Kairos Center Facebook page. So I just put that link in the chat too. If you're interested in ever being part of one of those services, just join us at 5 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Eastern for one of our Freedom Church of the Poor services. They also have Bible study on Wednesday night. You can find more information on the Freedom Church or on the Kairos Center, either Facebook page or website there. And finally, I just wanted to close with a reading. This is something that I wrote while I was doing some of this research in the midst of it to try to capture the spirit of what I was learning about the movement to end poverty, how it's representative of liberation movements that were led by Jesus and by the early church and today. So this is a reading. Some of the language will likely sound familiar. It's the language is based on 1 Corinthians 12 through 31, but I made it a bit, took a little modern take on it related to today's movement to end poverty and today's leaders. So this is called One Body. Indeed, the body, our movement of the poor and dispossessed, does not consist of one member, but of many. If the Freedom Church of the Poor would say, because we are not the Poor People's Campaign, we do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the National Union of the Homeless would say, because we're not the University of the Poor, we do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less part of the body. For if the whole body were the University of the Poor, where would National Union of the Homeless be? If the whole body were the Reading the Bible with the Poor cohort, where would the nonviolent Medicaid army be? But as it is, God appointed the members of the body, each of them, as God desired. If all were the Freedom Church, where would the rest of the movement be? As it is, there are many members, yet one body. The Kairos Center cannot say to the Fight for 15, I have no need of you. Nor again the National Union of the Homeless to the University of the Poor, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the members of the body that you might think are weaker are actually indispensable. And those members of the body that many think are less honorable, we bestow an abundance of honor. And those who need developed as leaders are treated with the greatest respect. But God has so appointed the body, giving greater honor to those in need of support and development, that there may be no dissension within the body, but the members may have the same care for one another. If one individual or organization suffers, the whole movement suffers together. If one member is victorious, all rejoice. Now we are the body of this movement. Each of our collectivities make up our movement, and God has given all kinds of gifts to this body: teachers and interpreters, mobilizers and base builders, prophets and healers, scholars and organizers, and all kinds of leaders. Can we only be mobilizing? Can we only be educating? Can we only be base building? No, but we must earnestly seek to continue to grow in our gifts and to develop the gifts of others for the whole body, for our whole movement. May it be so. That's kind of our closing benediction today, something that I was inspired by in getting to talk to these 10 leaders of this movement and hear about their organizations and how they use the Bible in their work. So I want to thank you all for being here today. It was really great to see you. Thanks for your participation, and hopefully you'll join us for our next Lunch and Learn on the third Thursday in September with Hannah. Take care, everyone. Be safe.